So some quick facts. According to the November 2020 report from CTV News, titled Tips for Millennials Looking to Buy a Home in Ottawa, 29% of Ottawa is made up of millennials, which is more than any other demographic. They are a very educated generation, with around 79% having a college or university education. They are different from the previous generations, as many millennials have who are coming into the housing market. They have a single income. They plan to have kids later in their lives and have significant education loans or debts. So the report, after stating these facts, encouraged young people to become homeowners and accumulate equity so they could pay off their student debt a lot faster than by just staying at home and saving on their own. In another CTV News, which was titled Ontario Millennials Need to Save for Over 20 Years for Down Payment on a Home, that report talked about how in Ontario, the average home prices were just shy of $900,000. Meanwhile, average yearly income of millennials between the age 25 and 34 was around $50,800, and that to own a house, either the price of the housing had to drop down by $530,000, or the millennials had to earn 1.5 or 2 times more than what they were earning at this point. So on that premise, I would say we started to look at this lecture series. And also during the pandemic, a lot changed. So staying at home and working from home, it impacted the Canadian housing market. And it's still adjusting to the fluctuating supply and demands. The other thing that we focused on was the difference between renting and ownership modules. So the discussion of housing supply and affordability tend not to differentiate between the rental housing and housing for purchase. And this limits the ability to purchase property, place, and accumulate wealth. The other thing, housing by private for-profit providers represents the vast majority of the housing produced in Canada, and housing produced by not-for-profit providers and government agencies is not typically available for purchase. So this series then wanted to start pertinent conversations that understand and question the status quo of the housing sector, creating a space of dialogue that brings together participants who are millennials and experts in the housing market. So some of our panelists who are urban historians, housing developers and builders, financial and policy-making institutions, environmental experts, architects, planners, who will come and discuss challenges and possibilities arising out of the existing scenario in the housing sector. This is a collaborative project between the Israeli School of Architecture and Urbanism, Carleton University, the Bachelor of Interior Design program at Algonquin College, and not-for-profit organizations, the Canadian Centre for Mindful Habitats, and the Urban Land Institute in Ottawa. It is also graciously funded by a SHIRK Connection grant. And my name is Pallavi Swaranjali. I'm a professor and coordinator of the Bachelor of Interior Design program at Algonquin, and also a co-investigator on this grant with Professor Benjamin Gianni. So what we've done is we have this series divided into 4 sessions, and we are trying to look at the topic from through 4 lenses. The first one today is a historical perspective. The next session, which is happening next Monday, will be from a planning and design perspective. The third one from an affordability and financing perspective, and the fourth one will be from a sustainability perspective. So I would now like to introduce the session and our keynote for today, along with our panelists. So today's session is called The Homeownership in Canada and a Historical Perspective. It discusses and explores the whys, wheres, and hows of homeownership in Canada, including historical trends, policies, programs, and financial instruments that have encouraged it over the past century. And it is intended to set the context for the series as a whole and to explore the advantages, incentive, barriers, and disadvantages of ownership in the context of other tenure options. So we have today Professor Benjamin Gianni, who will set the stage for the discussion from a historical point of view. I'm pretty sure most of you know who Professor Gianni is, but for some of you who may not be very familiar, Ben is the associate professor and former director of the Israeli School of Architecture and Urbanism at Carleton University. He heads the fourth-year housing studio and coordinates the school's urbanism major. And his research interests, of course, focus on housing and urban development. So we also have our three panelists here. So we have Steve Willis and Ivana and Carla. So welcome to the three of you. The format is that we'll start with Ben, and then Ben will introduce our panelists and invite them over for a moderated discussion. So I hand it over to you, Ben. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Pallavi. I should acknowledge that Evan Garfinkel is here from the, I don't see him, he's probably hiding, from the Urban Land Institute. He's our incoming director of the Urban Land Institute of Ottawa. Thank you all so much for being here. It's actually a nice, intimate group to get started on this discussion. The discussion should be, I think, really stimulating over the next little while, and we've got panelists as well as a key speaker for all four sessions. So as Pallavi said, you'll get a range of perspectives over the course of the next 4 sessions, tonight included. The way we're doing it is that session 1 and session 2 are a week apart, then we take a break and come back in early March and do session 3 and session 4. So very much looking forward to it, and hope that you can not only attend tonight, but we'll pique your interest and get you to come back for the subsequent sessions, which should be fantastic. So thank you, Pallavi. Great. Yeah, this is, I should point out Dan Dixon. I think this whole series started, interestingly enough, with a discussion with Dan. Dan is Senior Vice President of Finance at Minto, and Dan wanted actually to put together a series on housing, given that housing is very much in the news these days and affordability is a major issue. So we talked about it for a number of months, and then the opportunity came up to collaborate with Pallavi and to go for the grant, and so we kind of took it in a slightly different direction, but I'm really pleased to say that Dan continues to be involved and will be here as one of the panelists next week, as well as being in the audience tonight. Great. So I always joke that somebody asked me to speak for 10 minutes. I said that's impossible. Can I speak for 3 hours? And indeed, a lot of the notes that I've got are from a course where I covered this same topic over 2 3-hour sessions. So I'm aware of how much I'm leaving out. Nonetheless, the challenge for today is to, I guess we should, there's our panelists, by the way. The challenge for today really is to set the stage for the next few discussions. So as an introduction to the series, the purpose of tonight's session will be to set the context, both historical and current, and to provide a few definitions. I'll attempt to spend no more than 30 minutes doing this, maybe less, after which we'll shift formats to a discussion. And we've got a great group of experts here with us this evening to field questions, a few of which I've put together, and many of which I hope will be coming from you. So as the series focuses on home ownership and millennials, we should start by defining millennials and explaining why we're focusing on home ownership. Pallavi, I think, introduced those two issues, or those two topics earlier, so she stole a little bit of my thunder, but nonetheless, we'll soldier on. So the definition that I found online is a little more generic than Pallavi's, which was tied to 2 very specific dates. Millennials, according to what I found on Wikipedia, were persons born between the early 1980s and the late 1990s. As such, we can assume that they're children of baby boomers, which is an interesting way to put them in context. that they are aged roughly between 25 and 40, and indeed they are the group that is most likely to be attempting to enter the housing market even as we speak. So just to put that in context. And as affordability is the biggest barrier to home ownership, and in this series we're going to talk not only about affordability issues, but also the issue of choice, what the marketplace actually provides. Choice with respect to the design of the units, the location of the units, and also the financing options that are available to get into ownership. But as affordability is such an issue, and arguably the key issue, we want to clarify what we mean and how we are defining that term. So to do so, we should start by distinguishing housing affordability from, indeed, affordable housing. Where housing affordability is concerned, it's a general problem that cuts across all housing types and tenures and affects most demographic groups. There's probably only a very, very small percentage of Canadians that are not affected by this. Whereas affordable housing typically refers to a subset of rental housing that's made available to tenants at below market rate. So again, housing affordability is really the big issue, deals with all demographic groups and deals with a range of different tenure options, so rental and ownership, whereas affordable housing, even though we tend to use these words interchangeably, it's good to distinguish them, typically refers only to rental housing and to that subset, which is priced below market rate. As affordability is a relative term, we might define it as the measure of housing cost in relation to household income adjusted for household size and composition. I apologize that seems to be quite a mouthful, but that's really what it comes down to. And being a relative term, it's important to note that what's affordable to one household may not, and is likely not going to be affordable to another. And as such, it's important to ask affordable for whom. In other words, to which demographic group are we referring when we address the issue of affordability? I think this is why we were very clear that we didn't want to take on the issue of affordability writ large. We really wanted to focus it on one tenure option, which is home ownership, and one demographic option, because the issues will be different for every demographic group. This being the case, okay, so housing cost, right? It's how much does it cost to rent, or indeed what's your mortgage cost going to be per month after all is said and done, plus the other expenses associated with ownership, in relation to your household income, but it has to be adjusted for household size and composition. So for instance, a 5-person household comprised of 4 adults might look very different than a 5-person household comprised of a 1 adult and 4 children. And the needs might be quite different depending on whether those adults are sharing a bedroom or not sharing a bedroom. And so really, we really can't look at the larger issue of what's affordable relative to household income until we know a little bit more about the household size and the composition. So that being the case, we often resort to a few rules of thumb to help us measure affordability as it relates to home ownership. And these are, first of all, that a unit is considered to be affordable if its occupants are required to pay no more than 30% of their annual pre-tax household income to occupy it. And this rule applies to all units, whether or not we rent or own. A student in class asked me, where did this rule come from? When you do some research, no one quite knows where it came from. It sort of appeared as early as the 1920s, and it seems to have held steadfast for the better part of a century, and so we've now accepted this axiom as relatively true. So David, what you do is you would take your annual income, divide it by 12, and then divide that by 0.3, and if you're spending more than that per month on housing, you can't afford it, okay? All right, so that's the first rule of thumb. So we should also qualify that here we are privileging affordability and not necessarily suitability. In other words, a 1-bedroom apartment that might be affordable to a family of 5 is not necessarily suitable for a family of 5. And it's for this reason that it's important to take household size and composition into account. So the second rule, which applies specifically to housing for purchase, is that you can afford a house that's valued at 4 times your annual income. So David, 4 times 20,000, you can afford a house that's what? I'm just kidding. I'm going to pick on David here. Pick on another student. Well, in class, it's easy to say 4 times 0 is 0, right? So, but some of you out there are earning money, thank goodness. So, yeah, so that you can afford a house that's valued at 4 times your annual income. Now, to make such a statement, a few qualifiers are clearly in order, and the first is that this rule takes into account not only the monthly mortgage obligation, but the range of other expenses, which would include taxes, utilities, maintenance, private mortgage insurance, for instance, if you're putting down a less than 20% down payment, that homeowners are expected to pay. Now, maintenance could be the cost of maintaining your house, or it could be indeed HOA or condo fees if you've bought into a condo. Given these expenses, there are no direct equivalents between mortgage and rent. For instance, if you can afford to pay X amount of rent per month, it doesn't necessarily mean you can afford a mortgage for which you'll have to pay the same amount, because there are all kinds of other expenses that go into ownership. The cost of owning will always be higher than simply one's monthly mortgage obligation. Yeah. And indeed, your mortgage rate can vary, it can go up or down, but those costs per month are often quite fixed. So as we'll see in a few minutes, the 4 times multiplier only works when interest rates are about 5% or lower. If interest rates creep up, the multiplier drops to 3 or even lower. So when I look and research this, I'm actually often seeing 3. And then when you go to realtor sites and they're advertising what you can afford, it's much higher than the 3. And so I've settled in on the 4 with the caveat that that has to be adjusted for interest rates, and we're going to look at that in a minute. But it tends to work where we are right now, which is 5 or below. Now, having defined millennials and affordability, we need to explain why we should consider barriers to ownership. And 2 objections are frequently raised. First, as low-income households are disproportionately affected by housing affordability, why not focus on affordable housing? And by this we mean focusing on the production of rental housing made available at below market rates. The poorest among us, this sounds scriptural, the poorest among us will never be able to afford to buy, and as such, shouldn't we focus on them? Isn't ownership, as they say, a first world problem? The second objection is that despite what appears to be an affordability crisis, the rate of home ownership is not only high in Canada, but is actually relatively consistent with rates in other developed countries. So here we see Canada 66.5, US 65.5, Australia 66, EU is 70. Oddly enough, when you look at ownership patterns in the EU, the highest ownership patterns are in the former Soviet bloc. So Romania, Bulgaria, Poland. I think it was largely because, and maybe Ivana can fill us in on this, the land was socialized, or property was socialized under the Soviet regime, and therefore there was a kind of redistribution when the Soviet system broke down and property was distributed out in a slightly more equitable way than it might be in more democratic free market economies. How did I do on that? How did I do on that? You'll talk. Okay, we'll talk. Okay, good. All right. So addressing the first of these questions, why focus on ownership when, oops, you're not supposed to see that thing on the bottom there. It's extremely important indeed to look at this question. Affordable housing is an issue to which we need to return again and again. But for the purpose of this particular series, it's important to note that the discussion of ownership does not preclude the discussion of the production of affordable housing. Indeed, the two are related. Because, among other reasons, this is because people can't afford, when people can't afford to buy, oops, they rent. And increased demand in the rental market puts pressure on the market and drives up rental prices. And this is not easily addressed by increasing supply. Rents on most new rental housing are far above the average median rental rate for existing housing, and therefore new housing actually increases the supply but drives the average median rate in housing upward. And here I'm looking at Dan. Dan, did I get that right? I happen to know that, yeah, you can't, Minto can't build a building these days, at least not on Beechwood, without rates, rental rates which are well above the average median rental rate for similar units. So it's not just as simple as increasing supply. Okay, secondly, seniors are the largest group in need of affordable housing, and incentives that enable people to own their homes by the time they retire relieves pressure on the affordable housing stock, which is exceptionally difficult to produce. in some ways it's easier to produce market housing than it is to produce affordable housing. So if we can take any pressure whatsoever off the affordable housing stock, that's a good thing. Now, equally important is how you position yourself relative to this question, in other words, home ownership or rental. And this will depend on how you envision or you frame the larger issue of housing. Do you, for example, see housing as a right? If so, is the state responsible for housing? Can you also accept housing as a commodity that's produced, bought, and sold on the marketplace? And secondly, do you see housing primarily as shelter, or do you also accept it as a means of wealth creation? And these are very controversial topics. I joke my students in the school that they take all their geography courses where they have a very good Marxist perspective, and housing is clearly a right and housing is clearly shelter. And then they come over to my class and we also talk about housing as wealth creation, and I just think that's probably taboo, but we're not in the university per se tonight, so I can actually say that out loud. Okay. So coming back to the second question then, why discuss ownership or why worry about ownership when the country's ownership rates are comparatively respectable? It's important to keep in mind that the current rates of home ownership reflect the past, but not necessarily the future. The vast majority of homeowners in Canada are baby boomers who arguably were able to buy in at much more affordable rates. And we'll come back to this and look at some statistics. I think back at my own home ownership history. I bought my first house when I was 27 maybe, and it was a 12-room Victorian house for $80,000. So clearly it was affordable for me. It was the right place at the right time, and then we got in, and I sort of managed to squeak in no problem. But that's just not the case anymore. Okay. So now we're going to turn to the question of why governments would promote ownership. So arguably, support for ownership reflects a fundamental and long-standing relationship between property and governance. The presumption being that those who own property have a greater stake in the stability and larger order of society. Indeed, for centuries, only those who owned property could vote. In its very inception, then, democracy presumed widespread property ownership. When you think about Thomas Jefferson's vision for the US or for the North American continent, the idea was to divide it all up into 6 square mile grids and give a grid of farmland to everybody so that everyone would own land and everyone could participate equally in the democratic experiment. So it's important to think about that historically. It's only really been in the last century that there hasn't been an absolute direct relationship between property ownership and the right to participate in government. Secondly, and arguably more important, owning creates wealth and promotes self-sufficiency. And while that's a good thing in and of itself, why would the state promote ownership? Largely because it relieves the state, it relieves the government from a number of obligations, including producing and operating housing, supporting renters upon retirement, in other words, supporting people after they stop earning money and can no longer afford to make rent, and indeed the obligation to bail people out if and as emergencies arise. So as a form of enforced savings, home ownership represents equity against which to borrow in the case of emergencies. Case in point, one day, it sounds like the Beverly Hillbillies, we walked outside and there's a little trickle of water spurting out of the ground. We thought, that's kind of interesting. So we started to look into it a little bit, and lo and behold, the lead pipe from the city's connection here, I'll look at Steve, to our house had burst a leak, and even though it was, 5 or 6 feet under the ground, it was coming up like a little fountain out of the ground, and anyway, we called the folks to deal with it, and they said, oh, yeah, we can take care of it. That'll be $11,000, please. Like, where, it's one thing to say, okay, yeah, we're going to save for it, but not having any water, you kind of think, okay, I got to find $11,000 in very short order. Who's in a position to do that? Well, homeowners, because they can actually borrow against the equity in their home. So it's extremely important. Actually, people who don't have that safety net to back them up often tumble into really a downward spiral, lose their homes, et cetera, et cetera. So it's actually quite serious. And finally, ownership creates and sustains a healthy middle class. The percentage of population that own their homes is usually tied to an assessment of the level of social and economic development in a given region or country. And we have only to look at China to understand this. China created a middle class virtually overnight by transferring state-owned dwellings to residents and by privatizing the property market. As you might know, China's economy technically is still a top-down command economy, but they have completely privatized, well, not completely, but they've largely privatized the housing market. So we have actually a market economy working kind of within a larger command economy. Indeed, we might argue that keeping people out of ownership prevents them from accumulating wealth. Maybe I'm back on the, yeah. We might argue that keeping people out of ownership prevents them from accumulating wealth. It prevents people from benefiting from the increase in value of the properties they occupy. We see this in places like Angola, where a large number, I'm going to look at David on this one again, where a large number of the dwellings in the city of Luanda were self-built, and therefore they're squatter dwellings. The property values in Angola and the city of Luanda have just gone insane, and yet the people who are occupying that land don't benefit. It's not, that increase in wealth is not benefiting the people who are actually living there. So it's, if you really want to share the wealth around, you really need to kind of distribute property. Keeping people out of ownership prevents people from benefiting from the increase in value of their property or the properties they occupy. And this is a key issue here, it perpetuates the cycle of intergenerational poverty for the poor. So if you rent, likely you will not accumulate wealth, therefore you cannot pass that wealth down. And without that wealth, it's going to be hard to get into the property market, which means your kids will rent, and their kids will rent, and their kids will rent. And we see that with racialized groups in the States, African Americans in particular, and to some degree with in the indigenous population here in Canada. Keeping people away from being able to purchase property erodes the middle class. It's the middle class largely, we'll talk about this, gains their money through property ownership. And indeed, all of that puts a lot of pressure on the welfare state. So in fact, it's self-interest largely that underlies the state's desire to promote ownership. It's really about redistributing responsibility to citizens, empowering them, as opposed to having to take on more and more of the responsibility through the welfare state. So again, at the bottom there, the key principle is that people rarely accumulate wealth from their salaries. Households tend to spend what they earn. I can attest to that. The primary mechanism for wealth, at least for those who don't have it already, is indeed property, okay? Or it has been. As you probably know, I didn't give you that rule of thumb, but the rule of thumb is that the average property will double in value every 10 years. So the house that I live in, which is worth about $700,000 now, we bought for $70,000 about 30 years ago. So it's the multiplier does work, or at least it's worked for me. If you get caught in a correction, that's a different issue. But if you can hold tight, it's a little like the stock market. General pattern is that properties will double in value every 10 years. And that's cumulative, so doubles, and then that double doubles, and then that double doubles. Is that an allusion to Tim Hortons? Okay. So, assuming they do, how do governments promote home ownership? And this slide presents what I'll admit is definitely a non-exhaustive list. First and foremost, governments in North America promote ownership by supporting long-term self-amortizing mortgages. That is, mortgages that are fully paid out over a period of about 25 to 30 years. And as we'll see in a minute, the longer the term of the mortgage, the lower the monthly mortgage obligations are for a given property. Secondly, the government promotes ownership through mortgage guarantees, which reduces the risk for lenders and keeps interest rates close to the prime rate. Mortgage rates are relatively low because they're actually guaranteed against a real asset, something which is there. I always say to the students, what's going to cost more, a mortgage or a construction loan? And the students say it's the same thing. There's a house involved both ways. I say, no. In the case of the mortgage, if you default, there's something there to take back. In the construction loan, you default, the money just disappears into thin air. But really, mortgage rates are as low as they are, and we might argue that they're not as low as we'd like them to be. In other words, they hover close to prime largely because the government offers guarantees on those mortgages. And Carla could tell us a little bit about that in our discussion session. Thirdly, ownership is promoted by making low down payment loans available to first-time homebuyers. And in Canada, these loans are offered through CMHC and in the States through the FHA. As I understand it, maybe Carla can correct me, you can qualify for, well, in our area, you could qualify for a CMHC loan with 10% down as long as your property is less than $1 million. Once it goes over $1 million, it's 20%. And guess what? The average freehold property in Toronto, it's over $1 million. So you can't even, to add insult to injury, not only are the properties in Toronto extremely expensive, but you can't get in without a 20%, or at least you can't get into most of them without a 20% down, which is substantial. Okay. Next point is the governments promote ownership by buying mortgages back from banks, and this assures that banks have the funds on hand to keep issuing mortgages. So one of the things that occurred very early on is that banks came back to the federal government saying, you're encouraging us to give out mortgages, but we've depleted our supply of money, and the government had this great idea, okay, we'll buy those mortgages back to you, we'll return the money to you, and you can issue new mortgages. In the States, those buybacks are done by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Again, Carla can remind us how, if and how this is done here in Canada. Okay, I'm seeing an amen there. Governments also give a big boost to ownership and address decreasing affordability by broadening the categories of housing for which it's possible to secure financing, in other words, and to own, notably non-freehold units such as condominiums. This was a significant game changer and has done a lot to help revitalize cities. It represented the condominium designation, which really came on board. When I read, it says the 60s, but I don't remember really seeing much of it until the 70s. It represented a new lowest rung in the property ladder when single-family houses became too expensive for first-time homebuyers. I do know that single-family houses became too expensive for first-time homebuyers sometime in the early 60s. Suburban land was running out. Land prices were high. It simply wasn't possible to build the starter homes, the post-war starter homes the way we've been building them in the 50s, and therefore something had to give, and what ultimately gave was a broadening of what qualifies for financing and therefore what we can actually purchase. I remember reading in an issue of Architectural Digest from the 1950s, it was a profile of a building, an apartment building in Cuba, and the author said, the amazing thing is that people who live in this apartment building can actually own their units. And then there was this really interesting reflection saying, you know, if we were to introduce a policy like that in the United States, it could really help cities. In other words, we wouldn't have to move to the suburbs to buy a house. So really, up until the 1970s, the only product that most of us could finance, and therefore the only product that most of us could buy, was a single-family detached house. And the only place you could afford to buy a single-family detached house is in the suburbs. Ergo, notwithstanding what Alain Migueles will tell us about evil intentions on all sides, the suburbs were really the only solution to getting people to ownership in that period of time before, and in fact, there were other ownership options like condominiums. And I'd be very happy to discuss this with Steve and all the others in the discussion. So Ivana's already written to me saying she doesn't agree with some of the things I say, so I'm looking forward to a very well, some of the things in my notes anyway. I'm looking forward to a very lively discussion. So, next, governments promote ownership by not taxing capital gains on the sale of a primary residence. By not doing so, the government will allow you to keep the so-called unearned equity, which results from the tendency for properties to increase in value over time. The reality is, if you look at how much you actually pay for a house, the purchase price for which would be $700,000, it's going to be significantly more over the course of the mortgage than $700,000, and therefore you could also argue that it's actually fairly equitable for governments to allow you to keep that unearned equity, that equity that results from the increase in property value, because in fact you have paid for it. But again, that may be something that Carla wants to talk about. And then finally, governments promote ownership by making mortgage interest tax deductible on your primary residence. Now, this is done in the US, but for better or for worse, it's not done here in Canada. Being able to deduct mortgage interest against your income significantly reduces the cost of owning, largely because virtually everything that one pays out in a mortgage at the beginning of that mortgage is interest. So let's say you have finance a house and you're paying $3,000 or $4,000 a month in mortgage. That $3,000 or $4,000 a month is entirely deductible in the early part of your mortgage because it's all going to interest. It's part of what reduces the risk of mortgages for banks is that they collect all their interest first before they allow you to start to pay down the principal. Okay. So the major advantages of this is that homeowners can deduct most of what they pay out in mortgage when they are young and when their incomes are low. The presumption being that as you get older, your income increases, and then therefore, as you start to pay principal down as well as interest, then you'll be able to deduct less, but you can afford to deduct less because your income is higher. So homing in on the first item on this list, namely long-term mortgages, this slide demonstrates the advantage of increasing the term of the mortgage. And here we're looking at three scenarios. Keeping the purchase price and interest rate constant, we see the effect of extending the mortgage from 10 years on the left to 30 years on the right. It literally halves the monthly mortgage obligation. And inversely, it means that the same owner could afford a slightly more expensive home. With a 10-year mortgage, the owner would need an income of $311,000 for that $700,000 property, whereas with a 30-year mortgage, they would only need an income of $176,000. So the conclusions there: tripling the length of the mortgage halves the monthly mortgage cost and almost halves the income required to afford the same property. It is absolutely substantial. Again, Carla could tell us why Canada does 25 instead of 30. The other thing about Canada, as you might know, is you have to renegotiate every 5 years, whereas in the States you can lock it in for 30 years, for better or for, well, you're not locked in. You can always refinance. Okay, so on this slide, this is the other side of it, we can observe the impact of interest rates, which was the second item on our list of the way that governments support ownership. In other words, second on the list was government support ownership by keeping mortgage interest rates low. So comparing the effect, for instance, of a 10% increase in down payment to a 5% increase in interest rates, we see interest rate has a significantly greater impact on affordability. Decreasing the down payment from 20 to 10% only required the income to increase by about $15,000. So in the first case, let me see if this works, we needed $174,000. This was with a low interest rate, 5%, and a high down payment. In the second case, we have that low interest rate. I know you guys are looking at low and thinking, what? But I remember when it was 17%. Yeah, and I was an adult when it was 17%. And low down payment here of 10%. And then the worst case scenario, a high interest rate, 10%, and a low down payment of 10%. And you can see the income required here is 174. Jumps up slightly if we put less of a down payment down, but if we adjust the interest rate and add 5 points to the interest rate, it goes up substantially to 269,760. So that's quite a jump from 174 to 269. It's a jump of about 100,000 just to afford the same property. Okay. Both long-term self-amortizing mortgages and loan guarantees were introduced by governments, mostly federal governments, during the Depression to address a spate of foreclosures. So people back in that era really took about 10-year mortgages and were required balloon payments at the end of those mortgages, and there were foreclosures happening left, right, and center. And so what the government did is said, if we can convince lenders to extend the term of those mortgages from 10 years to 30 years, we can assure them actually that by then property prices will have bounced back and they won't lose, and we can reduce the monthly obligation. Not only that, we can reduce the monthly obligation by extending the term, but we can, the second thing we'll do is we'll provide loan guarantees so that if the borrower defaults, the government will refund the lender and therefore reduce the risk of loss for the lender, and in so doing, the lender was required to reduce the interest rates down to close to prime. So again, notably, however, both mechanisms were extended into the post-war period and represent some of the most important of all government interventions into the housing market. Again, two things, keeping interest rates low and extending the length of mortgages. Keeping interest rates low by offering guarantees, I should say, and then extending the length of mortgages. To address severe housing shortages coming out of World War II and in light of high rental rates, the goal of the government guaranteed self-amortizing loans were used to bring down the cost of buying down in line with the cost of renting an equivalent unit. So interestingly enough, after the Second World War, the marketplace was actually able to rise to this challenge by shifting from constructing individual houses for individual owners to what we call production building. and by constructing small homes on cheap land on the periphery. And here we're looking at an image of Levittown, Long Island, where some 17,000 starter homes were built in a period of about 4 years. Dan, does Minto do better than that? It does now, okay. The Cape Cod houses that you see here are virtually identical to those built in Manor Park here in Ottawa. So if you want to see what Levittown looks like, go to Manor Park. Oh, Itai's, yeah, Manor Park, good. Okay, so given the rapid rise in home prices, however, we might ask, what good is it promoting ownership when the marketplace can't produce housing that people can afford to buy? And here we're looking at some figures, and they are not pretty. The income required to purchase a property here in Ottawa, and by this I mean a modest condominium, is $90,000 plus a down payment of $36,000. So you would need an income of at least $167,000 to purchase a freehold property, and this includes townhouses, and also assumes you could come up with a down payment of close to $70,000. And while this is doable for baby boomers with high salaries at the end of their careers, especially those who are selling off expensive houses and downsizing, this is way out of the reach for most millennials who are just starting up the property ladder. But indeed, the situation is much worse in Toronto. One would need to make at least $170,000 to afford a modest condo in the GTA, and make at least $345,000 a year, plus come up with a down payment of $275,000 to afford a modest detached house. Okay, I think Pallavi was kind of getting at some of these issues as well. I should mention the purchase for a 2-bedroom condo. This is going to sound a little weird, but that's like so 2 weeks ago. When I checked today, it was substantially higher again. So property prices are increasing as we speak. It's a little hard to keep track. I also wanted to point out that, and Gord, you'll like this, this was the price in 2019 or 2021 to purchase a 2-bedroom condo in the Canal Building. 2-bedroom condo, $815,000. Yeah, and that's probably gone up since then. So when we say the average price of a condo in Ottawa is relatively affordable at $358,000, you have to remember this is probably not the condo you want to live in, or it's likely not going to be the condo that you want to live in. When you think about more favorable locations and extremely well-designed architecture, you're going to have to buy or pay a premium for that. Okay, so clicking through these figures, and this is a little bit fun. So the median cost of a 1-bedroom apartment renting in Ottawa is unaffordable to 30% of the households in Ottawa. Median cost of a 2-bedroom apartment is being $19.65 a month is unaffordable to 35% of the households in Ottawa. A condo purchase is unaffordable to 42%. And here, I mean, really a starter condo, probably a small 1-bedroom, unaffordable to 42% of households in Ottawa, unless they're, of course, downsizing. The average freehold property in Ottawa at $670,000 is unaffordable to 64% of households in Ottawa, unless they're trading up or downsizing. And that condo at Zibi is going to be unaffordable to 75% of households in Ottawa, unless they're trading up or downsizing. Really understand that. If you're trading up or downsizing, you're actually cashing in a property which you've accumulated some equity, and therefore you have more equity to bring to bear against how much you're financing, and therefore it can become affordable. Income thresholds for Toronto: a median cost of a 1-bedroom apartment, $2,300 a month, unaffordable to 44% of the households in the GTA. Average cost of a 2-bedroom apartment in the GTA, and you notice the ones in Toronto in the 416 are higher. That median cost of the 2-bedroom apartment in the GTA, unaffordable to 62% of households in the GTA. That condo, average modest condo, unaffordable to 79% of households in the GTA, unless downsizing. Freehold townhouse, unaffordable to 88% of households in the GTA. And detached house, unaffordable to 90% of households in the GTA, unless they're bringing some kind of property to bear on that purchase through either downsizing or trading up. Okay. In this slide, oops, oh, there's the other two. Oops. Okay. In this slide, and here I just encourage you to thank you, Kyle, for making the big screen because it's all worth it for this particular slide. Here what we're doing is we're mapping income to property prices. So up top we have income by household Canada-wide. So these are the quintiles, 20%, 40, 60, 80, and 100. And here you see where incomes fall into there. So it's about 8.8% of Canadians as a whole make, I can't even read it now myself, more than 200,000 a year. It looks like about 19% of Canadians at large, households in Canada make over 100,000 a year, and then we work our way all the way down here. Household income in Toronto and household income in Ottawa. First of all, you want to notice that income in Toronto and Ottawa are actually higher than income in Canada as a whole. And that shouldn't be surprising because it's actually more expensive to live in cities than it is to live outside of them. So when we home in on cities, we'll see higher. The other thing that's interesting is that actually Ottawa has higher income, slightly higher income than even the GTA. So the first thing you might notice is, and I mentioned this before, is that you have to be in the highest income quintile, the highest 20% of income to afford to buy pretty much anything in the GTA. You'll see the quintile goes from 80 here to 100, and pretty much all three property options, the modest condo, the average residential property, and the detached house all fall into that highest quintile. This means that as I mentioned, 80% of residents, assuming they were to enter the housing market today, could not afford to buy a property in Toronto. Now, things look significantly better in Ottawa. Not only are prices to rent and to buy significantly lower than they are in the GTA, but the average income in Ottawa is actually a little bit higher. So returning to our observations about mortgages, if we accept, and again, I'm going to ask Carla to maybe address this. If we accept that the idea or the goal of the long-term government-backed mortgage, at least the goal of extending them into the post-war period, was indeed to bring down the cost of purchasing in line with the cost of renting an equivalent property, we might stand back and ask ourselves how we're doing. Okay, so let's look at this. So in Ottawa, the gap between what it would cost, for instance, to rent a two-bedroom apartment and what it would cost to get into the housing market, we have about $11,000 income gap there. Okay. Again, I can't tell you, that's the average condo cost in Ottawa. It was at least 2 weeks ago. I can't tell you if it's got 2 bedrooms or 1 bedroom or 1.5 bedrooms, but there is some relationship between the first rung on the property ladder and what it costs, for instance, to rent a 2-bedroom apartment. When we look at Toronto, however, there we go, that gap is $55,000 between what it would cost to rent a 2,000. So not only are the rental costs significantly higher in Toronto than they are in Ottawa, but the gap between the ability to rent and the ability to buy is $57,000 in the GTA as compared to only about $11,000 in Ottawa. Oh, Pallavi was talking about headlines, I guess, from CTV. I remember reading a headline in the Globe and Mail that said, if you want to buy a property, get the hell out of Toronto and Vancouver. And that was directed toward millennials. Evan. Oh, okay. Oh, how am I doing? Time-wise, I'm not doing well. Okay. See, I told you this would happen. There we go. So, okay. So I'd like to move us toward our discussion with a few slides that reflect upon where we've come from and where we might be headed. Okay. Prior to government programs introduced during the Depression, households in the cities in Canada were about 60% rental and about 40% owner-occupied. All housing, with exceptions of a few examples of philanthropic housing, was produced by the marketplace. Even philanthropic housing was often called percent housing or 4% housing. The philanthropists guaranteed their investors at least a 4% return. As we noted, it was during the Depression that governments in North America first started to intervene. In both Canada and the US, governments introduced these new favorable mortgages, and in the US, the first examples of social or public housing were constructed during the Depression by Roosevelt's Public Works Administration. It was during this period that the phenomenon of market failure was finally acknowledged. In other words, there was finally consensus that even with incentives and supports, the marketplace would not be able to produce housing that was affordable for at least 20% of the population. This acknowledgement came much earlier in Europe, where governments had been constructing housing since the last decades of the 19th century. Actually, the first example of public housing in France was under Napoleon III, built around, believe it or not, 1850. In the UK, the first starts about 1870, and then we really start to see councils getting into it in the 1890s. But that's still several decades before North America. Coming out of World War II, governments intervened in the housing market in two ways. First, they began building social housing for the lowest quintile. In the US, ongoing funding for public housing in the post-war period came through the Housing Act of 1949. Been approved in 1939, but then that program was put on hold during the war, and they finally reinstated it in 1949. And Canada's first great experiment with social housing began with the construction of Regent Park, Toronto's Regent Park, which got underway in the late 1940s. Regent Park, as you might know, was funded through bonds issued by the City of Toronto, and federal funding for social housing was formalized in the mid-1950s through CMHC. But the bulk of what was built here in Canada was arguably undertaken by municipal and provincial governments. That doesn't mean the federal government wasn't involved. It just generally meant the provinces didn't want the feds doing anything directly. They wanted to grab the money from the feds so they could determine how much, if and how much they would pass down to the municipalities to build. Steve, you could probably talk more about that. The second important trend was to incentivize the private sector to build more, to build faster, and to build cheaper so that people could shift from rental to ownership. As such, the targets were to move from 40% ownership prior to, let's just say prior to the Depression, to 60% ownership coming out of the Second World War. And governments supported this effort by what I've described already, namely making low-interest loans available both to builders and to buyers, as well as constructing roads and investing in other infrastructure, the other infrastructure that's required to open up cheap, cleared farmland on the periphery to development. And again, we all know what that looked like. Over 50% of Canadians still live in single-family detached houses. In Europe, things looked a bit different, largely because the resources were scarce, and private industry was all but non-existent after the war, so the government stepped in and built directly. Most of the housing, in really up till the 70s, or I would argue even a little later, in Europe, especially in the UK, was built by the government under a kind of war measures, top-down approach to addressing the shortages. So it's enlightening to compare the situation in which we find ourselves today to the targets coming out of World War II. Okay, so here I've mapped the housing targets coming out of World War II to what we're seeing today. Okay, so what can we see? What can we notice here? In both Ottawa, okay, yes, where rental housing is concerned, the government still needs to step in to address the lowest quintile in Ottawa. In other words, it's not possible to afford any market housing if you're in the lowest quintile. But in Ottawa, you can actually afford some housing if you're in the second quintile. So that allows the market still to participate in building rental housing for the second quintile. But in the GTA, the lowest two quintiles, so here we are from 0 to 20 and 20 to 40, no one in those lower two quintiles, 40% of the population, more than 40% of the population, cannot afford market rental housing. When I say that, what is it? Lies, and damn statistics. Obviously, lots of people in Toronto can afford, but I'm just saying if they didn't have other sources of income, if they were all millennials, for instance, then 40% of them could not afford even to rent on income alone, could not afford to rent. So what's required then may be what we're going to call new categories of affordable housing, which would fall under attainable and workforce housing, those concepts. We'll come back to that in a second. And where housing for purchase is concerned, we notice that homeownership has moved into higher quintiles. In other words, homeownership was ideally supposed to start at about 40%. In Ottawa, the bulk of homeownership is actually beyond 60%. with the exception of that modest condo, which is still sitting down. So in fact, it is still possible to buy, or for the market to produce housing that's affordable to people in that third quintile, again with incentives. And I'm describing those long-term, self-amortizing, government-guaranteed mortgages, the incentives that allow a certain percentage of the population to get to home ownership that wouldn't be able to otherwise. So in both Ottawa and Toronto, homeownership has moved into higher quintiles, except for condos in Toronto, but condos in Ottawa. In Toronto, virtually all ownership falls into the highest quintile. So if housing prices stay as they are, Canada is on track to drop from 60% ownership to 20% ownership. Children of baby boomer homeowners, however, can use accumulated intergenerational wealth, in other words, loans or inheritance from parents, to decrease the amount of debt that they take on, and that's really the only way to get in to that housing market. So what can we make of this comparison? Okay, and here we are looking at the targets coming out of World War II versus where we appear to be heading. First and foremost, we can say that a greater percentage of the population will need subsidized housing. Likely the market will not be able to produce, okay, oh, I'm doing well. Likely not be able to produce for that second quintile either. And this is that quintile where we're going to need more below market rate housing. It's probably going to fall in. So even renters in the third quintile getting into market housing will require incentives to bring down the cost. Renters in that second quintile will likely fall into what's now being called, no, sorry, the second quintile is government. Renters in that third quintile, which is produced by the market, will likely fall into the categories which are calling accessible or workforce housing. And then finally, even with relatively low interest rates and long-term self-amortizing mortgages, we may now drop from 60% ownership down to 20% ownership. The barriers to home ownership will make it inaccessible for those who cannot bring intergenerational money to bear to contribute to the down payment. In other words, a few exceptions aside, the only ones who will be able to afford to buy are those whose parents already own. Thank you. Great. So now we can get the discussion going. If this had been a classroom, you guys would have been raising your hands and interrupting as we went, which would be fun. So I'd like to introduce our three panelists, and I'll ask them to come on up to the stage. First is Ivana Teodorescu. Ivana is an architectural historian. She's a teacher and artist whose interests and expertise span very varied fields. She trained as an architect in her native Bucharest, and she holds graduate degrees from the University of Cambridge, an MPhil, and a PhD from McGill. Her specialties are Canadian post-war housing and Byzantine iconography. Okay. Throughout her career, Dr. Teodorescu has contributed research for national exhibitions in federal museums in Ottawa. She's taught here in Canada and England and in Romania, and her courses covered architectural history, psychology of the built environment, research methods, technical drawing, perspective, and graphic presentations with studios in housing and hospitality and interior design. In 2012, her doctoral thesis was awarded the UQAM Phyllis Lambert Prize for the best dissertation on Canadian architectural history. She was interviewed by CBC Radio and the Ottawa Citizen on her research, which focused on changes to the Canadian house design since World War II, as shown in architect design publications published in CMHC catalogs from the 1950s to the 1970s, and built as such or adapted by builders and homeowners throughout the country. Dr. Teodorescu argues that these houses form a valuable architectural mass, and they are the expression of a mix of international and spontaneous strategies which help develop as well as still influence current Canadian society. Ivana is at the far end. Next to her is Carla Staracina. And Carla joined Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation, CMHC, in 1998 and worked on a variety of roles both in CMHC's Prairies and Atlantic offices. In 2013, about 9 years ago, she moved to Ottawa to take on the role of Director of Community Development and was appointed Vice President Affordable Housing in January of 2015. Carla also took on the role of Diversity and Inclusion Champion for CMHC in 2016. In 2019, Carla moved to her current role as Vice President of Risk Management, Strategy, and Products. Carla has a vast breadth of knowledge on the housing industry across all housing types and all segments of the Canadian landscape. She's truly grateful for a career where she has the opportunity to make a difference in helping Canadians meet their housing needs. And then finally, last but not least, is Steve Willis, who was likely very well known to all of you, and it's absolutely great to see Steve out here. If I were him, I would sort of stay out of the public limelight for the next 5 years to make up for all of the time he's put in over the last 10 years. Anyway, Steve is now at Stantec. He's back consulting and in the private sector. You probably know him more recently as the head of economic development for the City of Ottawa, but I'll read his biography as it appears on the Stantec website, which privileges, of course, Stantec. So Steve joined Stantec in August 2022 as the discipline lead for planning in Canada. And Steve is a registered planning professional planner, and professional land economist with over 30 years professional experience in consulting and in the various public sector roles. He specializes in building consensus for complex projects and involving approvals from multiple agencies. Over the course of his career, he specialized in the planning and redevelopment of lands for public agencies. Steve recently completed a role as General Manager of Planning, Real Estate and Economic Development for the City of Ottawa. As the organization's chief planner, he oversaw planning policy, transportation planning, environmental planning, and indeed development approvals. He led the completion of the new official plan, which involved significant efforts in growth management. Steve was previously also responsible for Infrastructure Services Group, which was responsible for the design and construction of municipal projects, asset management, and infrastructure planning. He has many years' experience presenting land use and infrastructure issues to the public, and he has extensive experience appearing before councils. Steve, you were also chief planner of the NCC for a while. Yes, it doesn't appear in your bio, but yeah. Great. So I might just start the discussion saying, are there any particular issues arising from the little introduction that I gave? Anyone want to weigh in on anything?
Sorry, I can't hear you very well,
Oh.
but I heard you better from there.
Oh, okay. No, rather than starting, I'll just stand out here. Rather than starting with questions, I thought if anyone has any responses they might want to make to the introduction. What did I get wrong?
I think there's a little bit of mix-up between the U.S. and Canadian markets when you describe some of the things. So CMHC is a crown corporation, and we have many roles. One of the roles is as a mortgage insurer. So in Canada, if you buy a house under $500,000, you can put as little as 5% or 10% if it's over 500. We do have a sandbox that DOF, Department of Finance, sorry, I'm a good bureaucrat with lots of acronyms, but the Department of Finance does have a sandbox in which we play and which lenders can play, and so those things of how much your down payment is. So the government does back mortgage insurance, which we offer. We also securitize, so buyback. We have one of the forms of financing for buying back mortgages. We have a few programs that we perform on behalf. It's Ginnie Mae in the U.S. that does that. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac do something else. So yeah, so there's a few differences in what we do. CMHC though also has. Yes, we do. We perform securitization, so we consolidate pools and buy them back for financial institutions. But there are other mechanisms that financial institutions can use. It's not just our tools. So we do have that. There are some private insurers that also compete with CMHC on a commercial basis for that PMI. So we have two, Sagan and Canada Guarantee, that provide some choice for Canadians when they.
Millennials, if you get a down payment which is lower than 20%, you're required to carry what's called private mortgage insurance on that, which really mitigates the risk to the lender and helps keep you on.
So you're buying insurance from CMHC, Sagan, and we guarantee the bank that.
Which again mitigates risk and keeps your interest rate.
Yeah. And then we also have other programs, though, at CMHC that are not offered as competitive because we do work for the government and have appropriation programs, like our first-time home buyer program, which the government buys a share of your equity in your home. We also have rent-to-own programs that we're exploring in our innovation program. So we test things, try things out, trying to do that full spectrum. So not only in home ownership, but across the whole continuum. And really that's where we play. Our economists like to say, I was saying to Steve, that the housing system in Canada is like a balloon. So if there's no rental supply, it affects home ownership supply. If home ownership, if interest rates go too high, it affects home ownership, which then also creates big demands in rental. And so we have to really, one of the key areas for CMHC is about the stability of that housing system in Canada. So we try to, yeah, so that's the only thing I would say. There's quite a bit of difference between the CMHC and Canada in housing and the US. And you mentioned it with capital gains and things like that, but it's, they are a little bit different. So when you try to draw parallels, it sometimes gets confusing.
I think historically the idea was when CMHC was created in 1946, so literally right after the end of the war. They got inspiration from the Federal Housing Administration, so they actually looked at their programs and everything that we're doing, and I think they adjusted stuff for, obviously for, the Canadian market. We tend to think that because of the proximity of Canada, to the U.S., and because they're obviously our biggest partner, trade partner, we tend to think that we're the same, but we really aren't in very many aspects. And housing is definitely one aspect. With regards to, I just want to intervene if that's okay. It got me thinking when you were talking about the sizes of the house. Well, first of all, the types of the housing that we have currently on the market. Historically, in the 50s and 60s, CMHC promoted very much, and that was the case with the Canadian market, promoted small houses. And actually my specialty is, I looked very closely at one program that they had in those 2 decades, which was called Small House Designs, where they produced a series of catalogs, plan catalogs, that were specifically geared to first-time owners and first-time buyers, and to people who couldn't afford the services of an architect. So they engaged architects around the country to create these, plans for a variety of little houses, actually, the ones that you see everywhere in what I prefer to call the former suburbs, because they're no longer suburbs, they're very much part of the cities right now. They are the bungalows, the 50s bungalows, the split houses that you might know, which were actually at the end of 50s, beginning of 60s, very short period, and then the 2 stories. Now, they evolved as housing types that way because of land purchase. The land in the beginning, the farmers at the fringe of the cities divided their lots. They sold them either individually or to small builders who would develop those parcels. And then as the demand grew, the house lot became more expensive, more and more expensive. I was actually looking at my thesis last night because I can't remember what I wrote there, honestly. But I sort of looked at it, and I just to pull out some, some numbers, and actually I talked to some residents in Rothwell Heights, which you might know is a neighborhood near Blair here in Ottawa. And they said that when they purchased, what was that? When they purchased their lot, it was in 1954, the lot was $1,000. It was a 15,000 square feet lot. In only 4 years, the price of the land literally quadrupled. This gives you an idea of, how fast things were happening in that time. And because of that, obviously, people couldn't afford the same amount of land. So the land, the lots being smaller, then that sort of triggered the necessity of having not spread out bungalows, but sort of going vertically, right? So and going through that intermediary phase of the split level, which I personally think a very, very interesting concept. However, in the 70s, so right after this small house design scheme actually ended, for a variety of reasons. In the 70s and 80s, we actually had, I think in the city specifically, a type of housing, which was the townhouses. Very preferred in that period. And personally, I think they still would be, now sort of dragging that into the present, personally, I think that would still be something that would be maybe something that should be considered. The problem today I find that with the housing market is that builders, when they build, they prefer to, and because, again, of the housing market in Canada, there's still a lot of single detached housing that are houses that are produced, and the builders sell those houses per square meter. So of course they want the houses to be large. Now looking at the household size, there's a discrepancy there. So you probably know, and you've noticed, there's a lot of big houses with only 2 people in it, or 3 people. Of course, if they can afford it, fine. But we have this problem when there's a lot of these big houses that are not affordable. So personally, my view on that would be that the government could have some incentive, or I don't know, something that obviously we can discuss into how can the government encourage the creation of smaller houses. The houses that people had in the 50s literally were 650 square feet. That's very little, as when compared to the over 2,000 square feet of an average house that we have today.
Let's stop there.
Sure.
It's sort of a Dan question, but Steve, do you want to address that?
Yeah, I mean,
Why should or would that be a good idea?
well, I think it's absolutely part of our future. There's a couple of points I want to pick up on. One is we got very entrenched in a pattern of single-family housing only is the only product available, and whereas Europe, where land prices were higher, did develop patterns of multifamily housing that were,
Housing for rent?
housing for rent. That's right. But we've, it would be nice to see a modern generation equivalent of what happened after the war, where there was a template of multifamily housing that was widely available, pre-approved by most municipalities to save time on the approval process, and that same sort of logic could be applied to deploy housing really quickly. So multifamily housing versions would be very difficult to do in most parts of Canada because of existing zoning. Now, big change in Ontario a couple months ago, where the province now has mandated that up to 3 dwelling units on a lot is now permitted across Ontario, which is a really big change, which might mean that there's something new that could happen in Ontario that couldn't have happened before. And we were going through the planning process in Ottawa for the new plan, and we tried to introduce that idea in a modest form, not quite as extensive as what the province did, and it had considerable pushback. So it's because people, it's because people are very comfortable with what they'd like new housing in their neighborhood to be much like what they have. They don't want the pattern to change, and it's understandable where that comes from. But if the housing crisis is where it is now, where we need to do new typologies of housing, then we need to bust that paradigm.
Steve, one of the concerns I have about that, at least in my neighborhood, is that you're replacing not only 1 unit for 3, but you're replacing owner-occupied with absentee landlord rental. In wealthy neighborhoods, that's fine. In the neighborhoods like mine, that gets a little bit more problematic. It's almost a discussion for our final session, which talks about the sustainability of communities. But I was going to ask Carla, so one of the reasons, so this is a Dan Minto question again, how would you incentivize, so it's not individuals building houses for themselves anymore, that time is long since passed. We're well into production building, and ultimately it's going to be the Madamies and the Kaidans and the Mintos that decide what gets built and for whom. One of the ways that builders were incentivized to build small was that those very favorable mortgages and the no down payment were only available if the house was less than X number of square feet and cost less than a certain amount. So if you were to create a market, the CMHC, for instance, is not beautiful.
Yeah, I won't be, but.
You got the power. If you were to create a market for something that doesn't exist, would, for instance, Minto start to build it?
So that's probably one of the biggest things we do is work with, CMHC isn't going to do anything. Of course, we need all 3 layers of government for sure, and housing is one of those things. But also working with the private sector to say, where should the incentive be? Is it in the rental stream? Is it in the homeownership stream? What is that? So if we're working with, and we do get all kinds of homeownership developers who want to do stuff on the edges, using materials, using different forms, using different types of ownership. We're doing one with Indigenous on homeownership in Quebec that's got a different kind of legal system than us. So absolutely, we're open to that and trying innovations and trying to see where it is. But the problem as a federal government is every city is different. Every zoning, every municipality. We're in the midst of doing what's called a Housing Accelerator Fund to try to do probably what the province of Ontario and BC have both done to try to incentivize municipalities, maybe to figure out ways to plan communities better that will densify, affect climate change the way we live. What are the ways that cities can be better? So we're absolutely open to it, but I don't know if there's still a demand for this other type of housing. The demand is there. And so it's hard to say to private sector, build this only. We do that with the $1 million cap. As you said, there is a $1 million cap, and it's not us. That's our regulators that say $1 million is all you can use mortgage loan insurance for. But there's still a lot being built over that $1 million.
So back to Ivana, my sense is that the starter home of the 1950s is now the condo of the 2000s. In other words, we start up the property ladder in a very different place.
Yeah.
And the market has adjusted to that. And then even to your point, Steve, about multifamily, it's the stacked town now, which has taken the place of the trade-up starter home. So you would, in principle, in Ottawa, you would move from the condo to the stacked town, and then finally, when your income is high enough, you've got enough equity in the properties you already own, you trade up a third time to the suburban house, which are, as you say, built at a much larger scale than they used to be.
We even see that in household formations in cities like Toronto and Vancouver, where it's not just a couple and their children, it might be 3 couples that buy a house together.
So Steve, back to your point, I would love to see densification, but I would love to see it in terms of products that were more geared toward purchase rather than toward rental.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I'd love to see is more innovation in what's actually on the market available, and it's starting to occur. People are having these conversations, like why is the 2,400 square foot house the only thing that's widely available? Part of it is because it is demand driven. It's exactly as you just said. But we need to socialize in our communities different forms of housing and make them more accepted in many communities. Smaller unit sizes, multifamily formats of housing so that you could put them in more places. And right now we seem to be in this, through much of Canada, the planning is, it's single family or towers, and there's not much in between.
In Ottawa, there is though. I mean, we have a big inventory of towns.
Yeah, Ottawa actually does reasonably well in that we do have some mid-rise products on some of our main streets, and we do have a lot of townhouse products, and stacked townhouses have caught on very quickly in Ottawa, where a lot of parts of Ontario they had not caught on. So if you go into Riverside South or Barrhaven and other areas, newer communities, Orleans, you will see lots of stacked townhouse products, which again, as you said, are actually entry level, the very first entry level opportunity for ownership outside of condos. We've had that type of innovation, but we need much more of that in Canada.
So I guess.
And there is some of that, not in my backyard too, and that I think is what Steve was saying. We have to be, like, let's go into where there is only single families and see how we can get the neighborhood to buy into some new forms.
You have to express what the advantages depends on the neighborhood, obviously. Again, my perspective is mainly, if I were at Alta Vista, my perspective would be completely different. And I understand that pushing density toward major and minor corridors can only go so far because the price of land on those corridors is so high. We have some questions from the audience.
Yeah, if you want to ask a question, you can raise your hand and I can come to you. We have a lot of questions, Ben. Let's start with you.
Hi, we were just speaking about stacked townhomes in Ottawa, and I was wondering if you could speak a bit to the phenomenon of a lot of those stacked townhomes, which would otherwise be entry-level homes, being purchased by investors and then rented.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, I mean, we don't regulate, we do regulate to a certain extent, but we don't widely regulate who can actually purchase. We have a no foreign buyers restriction, which, by the way, has a negative consequence, which is major tech companies in Canada can't attract talent anymore because people can't buy houses when they want to come to Canada. So these are difficult policy decisions, but we don't regulate heavily who has the right to buy, and that's the consequence of that, is you get some people in this for investment reasons.
We do have a supply issue in Canada, a huge, huge supply in all forms of housing, whether it be rental and ownership. We have a huge supply issue. Is it the right supply? But we don't have enough.
Is it what the millennials want? Yeah, co-op. Yeah, we will talk. In session 3, we're going to deal with exactly those issues. And I'm still unclear. We've been having many conversations about co-op, whether co-op is really different than condo in Canada, the equity co-op, and the entries to that are just incredibly high.
Yeah.
You can't attract financing for it, so you have to come cash in hand. So there's some barriers. Evan?
Yeah, thank you very much for coming tonight. I have 2 questions. Is that legal? Yeah, okay, we're good. One is more from a historical context, and the other is a little bit more forward-thinking. I don't want to dive and take too much from our next sessions. I'll shout out Dan because he's speaking at the next session, so I'm going to stay away from that. My first question, so I'm a Toronto transplant. I came to Ottawa in 2018. A lot of our kind of housing conversation the last couple of years has really revolved around COVID and how that's impacted. But one of the questions that I wanted to touch base on, we're focusing on the history of Canada, housing in Canada, is 2001 Mike Harris. How did amalgamation shape housing supply, the layout of the city in Ottawa? I've always found it very interesting that we just have this massive area, and we had kind of these cores, these nodes in Canada. We had it in Nepean, Ottawa Central, Orleans. How does that shape the city, our supply? And then looking forward, my second question is, just putting my developer hat on for a second. We talk about supply issues. We talk about, the pro forma and offering affordable options. One of those really difficult factors is dealing with land prices. And and I look at the condo market downtown right now. As a millennial, I go, why would I buy a condo when I can buy a single family home in Orleans? How does CMHC, and maybe my first question is best to Steve, and maybe my second is for CMHC, is what are we looking to do? Is the government looking to offer initiatives or anything to help incentivize or help lower those land prices or make it easier for developers to purchase? So kind of 2-part there, maybe if I want to start with Steve.
Yeah, I'm going to twist your first question a little bit and talk a little bit about the arc of history of planning in Ontario in the last 30 years. I just hit 30 years of my career this year, and it's made me think a little bit about what I've lived through in terms of change. So if you go back to when I first started in my career in the early 1990s, in most cases we had cities with regional governments. We had a lot of focus on development for the planned growth. We were starting to look at transit infrastructure in those days and starting to look at environmental protection in a big way in those days. But for the most part, it would take somewhere between 3 and 5 years to get a subdivision approved in Ontario, from the point of land was in an urban boundary to the point where building permits were issued, and that was the process. So over that time period, we've introduced layers and layers and layers and layers and layers of new planning regulation in Ontario, so that it now takes between 7 and 12 years in Ontario for land to go from raw land to an actual approved building permit. Ottawa is on the better end of that spectrum. Most of the developers in the room will disagree with me, but I can give you evidence that compared to other municipalities, we do okay, with some exceptions, notable exceptions. The other thing that's come in is we've introduced development charges in Ontario over that time period. You know, at the beginning, you know, if your house was built before the 1990s, you were the first landowner who purchased that did not contribute to municipal infrastructure in the purchase of your house, and therefore you did not put that on your mortgage as you went through. Today in Ottawa, depending on the unit size, it's between $35,000 and $50,000 of development charges are attached to your house, and that's just the municipal portion, that's not the school board portion. And if you run the same math that ran it while Ben was talking, so that's $290 of your mortgage every single month is going to pay for your contribution to fees. But if you were built before the 1990s, you didn't actually contribute to that. That was all dealt with through other ways. So we've now put more pressure on the homeowner to pay for infrastructure at the front end, and that's contributed to fees and charges. And that doesn't include all of the taxes that are going to inputs into actual construction. And there are finance people in the room who could probably tell you that I think I've seen numbers as high as a third of the costs of a housing unit are actually in various fees and charges from the public sector that have come in. And Dan probably staring me down whether I've got my number right or not, but that's pretty close. I mean, that's changed over that time period too. The other thing that happened in the late 1990s, early 2000s was a heavy emphasis on growth management, which is constraining outward growth of cities, condensing them in to prevent loss of farmland, the environmental impacts. We didn't know a lot about climate change in those days, but it's really the same logic that needs to protect it and basically reduce transportation needed for people in their daily lives, and that started changing the dynamic, and we significantly constrained around Ontario the outward growth and therefore the amount of land available. So we didn't allow land to be planned, and then when we did allow it in, it was taking now 12 years to come in. So if we look at where we're at in the supply crunch right now, all of these things cumulatively add up. There's a lot of virtue in those decisions about why we did it. There's not that they were ill-conceived or ill-meaning, but the cumulative effect of all of these different things we've done has put us in the supply situation where we're at today.
And like sensitive affordability.
That's correct.
From a land perspective on where do we incentivize, how do we incentivize, we look at that whole continuum. So we've got really big incentives, big subsidies for things like our rapid housing initiative, which is for that bottom quintile, that social housing quintile to do rapid that came through. We've got incentives for developers to build rental housing, where we'll direct lend the money to them if they agree to make things at below market rent for a period of 10 years. Or if they'll agree to climate change initiatives, we'll give them a break on the lending we'll do for the developer. If somebody's building, if a homeowner developer is coming in with an affordable housing scheme to build more affordable for particular borrowers, again, we'll give them some breaks on our insurance. But we also have land that's government land that will build, if you're building for affordable. We're looking at things like how to help groups change buildings that maybe weren't for housing. We've got some incentives in our rental construction incentive program, but that's the piece, not so much for individual homeowners. That's done through our mortgage loan insurance and securitization products. So.
Hi, I'm Ali. I'm a millennial. I have a question. I have two questions and maybe a comment. Sorry? Okay, well, maybe I'll leave the comment. Question for CMHC. Do you have a model? Like you mentioned a lot of options, like the 20%, they help like the opportunities that you just mentioned that for 10 years, if they keep it below market, after that, they could do whatever. does CMHC has a model that shows if in a utopian paradise, Government of Canada follows exactly what CMHC models, after 10 years, that Generation Z that's behind us right now in school, can they afford it? Like, do we have a proven model that if we follow everything, we'll still be here in 10 years, 20 years, or 30 years? Or are we just repeating the same thing that the other panelist in her thesis put in, and same issue happened in the 50s and 40s, but is there a proven model that, or at least a hypothetical model that shows this is the population, if we provide this much condos, this much micro pigeonholes, and this much 2,400 square foot suburban homes, does it meet the requirements of our society in 10, 20 years? Is it sustainable?
I can honestly say, and I have it on my phone, and I'm not going to pretend to put on my glasses and give you the exact number, but we did a we did a survey, we did some research on how short we are in supply, and it's a astronomical number of what that is, and I'm not going to quote the number because it's on my phone. 3.5 million. Thank you. I was going to say 1.2, and I knew I was off, so it's 3.5 million. Yeah. So we know that we have a serious housing crisis. We don't have the model that will say, so we've got different programs. Like I say, we've introduced in the last couple of years a first-time home buyers program where we'll share in the equity to help you we'll buy a share of your equity. Yeah.
Like a second mortgage.
Yeah, yeah.
We want to talk about that in a session.
Yeah, good. So we've got different things that'll look at that, but we are short in supply in all forms, tenures of housing. We don't have the magical plan that'll get us there, but we're hoping through looking at all the options, all the different ways that we can get there, but we don't have the magical pill that will fix it all. Because it requires all three levels of government. It requires the help of the private sector, the nonprofit sector. So that's where we're at right now in Canada.
It's nice to be audience to think about the generation behind me.
Yeah.
Really just thinking about yourself.
Hello, I'm Adam. I have a question about where the architects and the kind of creative design ideas are in this history. Because I know that there was a big push, pre-war for the kind of social housing and light and all that. And then that kind of fell apart eventually, and architects became preoccupied with glamorous things and sort of lost interest or were pushed out of the conversation. So when you're having these conversations at this CMHC or in municipal level, whatever, are there people with creative ideas involved in those conversations? Because I ask both in the kind of big scale picture, but also you're telling us that it's a 12-year process even to get something built, and we don't have the models. So we're looking at 25, 50 years from now, maybe we'll figure it out. But in the meantime, everyone's entrenched in their home ownership equity program, so no one's going to leave and get out of their 3,000 square foot house tomorrow and bring in a community of people, unless someone with a creative idea steps up, buys that house, and gets involved in the community. So where is the creative conversation in the problem solving?
I have seen many creative solutions. So I would say in Toronto, we've just been talking to one of a developer who's looking at it's more of an adaptable house, which could convert kind of the 3 units into one big unit, depending on the lifestyle and who's living in the house, those kind of things. Again, it's infill. I've seen in the city of Vancouver where it's more on a rental, where it's very impermanent housing on those empty lots that take 5 years to develop, how you can put impermanent housing but help those most in need. So there is some very creative architects that look at those houses that grow with different demographics and things like that, but you may have some other.
I think okay, so again, from the historical perspective, I think what CMHC actually did, again, in the 50s and 60s, with that very interesting scheme that they have, was they actually involved architects into the creation of plans. And what happened at that time, was that they literally sent out this call for, like we, you know, the academia now send out for call for papers. They sent out call for plans. And, you know, out there, all architects started to get ideas, and they submitted these plans to CMHC, to this particular plan selection committee. It was a very small division in CMHC that dealt with that. They were architects themselves, so they were promoting their own profession. Very interesting. But you also have to understand that that also happened at the time when the building codes and the regulations were also shaping up. So it was a very interesting period where people from the field, so architects from the field, came with solutions. They were talking obviously to clients, or, you know, they were doing their own surveys, if you want. And then they submitted this type of plans, which were put in the catalogs, which were offered to the public for, along with working plans, like literally, you know, a full set of blueprints for $10. Architect design plans. They were amazing, right? So, and so people could literally buy those plans from CMHC. Of course, again, this whole scheme was directed to people who would buy their own plans and who would build their own house, but also to small builders who bought one set of plans and they built a few, which was, you know, the way it was. So it wasn't necessarily okay if you want to think in terms of, oh yeah, they should have bought, I don't know, 10 plans of that, right? But it wasn't in the, you know, in the context of money. CMHC was not making money, obviously, of those plans. So, but they encouraged the involvement of architects in the housing market, which I think it was amazing, really. And if you look at the post-war, what we call nowadays the post-war housing, right? The 1.5 stories, which were pretty much the end of the wartime housing limited, right? But the bungalows, as I said, the split levels, the 2 stories, they are very adaptable as well as plans. So architecturally, they're really wonderful. And personally, I bought one of those houses, which is a semi-detached. And when I obviously informed by my own PhD, we bought it, you know, 10 years ago. But when I looked at the plan, I have 3 children. I looked at the plan, I said, I can transform this very easily in 3 condos, if you want, inside my house. And I can leave, you know, my kids with 1 apartment up, 1 apartment at the ground floor, and 1 apartment in the basement. No kidding. So they were really well done, okay? And they are very easily adaptable. Whereas the new type of housing, single detached and quite large as a surface, the way they're compartmented inside does not allow for that. So I would agree that, you know, having architects nowadays through some kind of program involved again into the discussion of how do we design the new houses, and again, reducing or trying to optimize the square surface is very, very important. So definitely that would be a point of discussion. How do we involve architects again into the design of the new house?
We are seeing a lot more multi-unit built now than we did right after the war.
Right.
And because they're following a different code classification by code, architects have to be involved.
Yes.
I would argue that architects are, you know, as demographics change, as people have come back to the city and as race living over more density, we're finding out a lot more involvement from architects in the whole housing question than we would have 30 or 40 years ago. Most of the stuff that we have on the periphery, and now even most builders on the periphery are also building in the center, and most builders who are building in the center are building in the periphery. So a lot of those dichotomies that we had, we're not seeing as much. I won't say we're doing a good job of that. Gord actually. Yeah, architects are clearly more involved. Definitely a big point of view.
Hello. I'm not a millennial. I came here in 1981 after graduating from University of Waterloo for one drink with a friend, and I'm still here. So after many years of frustration dealing with the city, long story short, I now have a development company, which is Terrion Vendor Builder Net Zero registered. And I'm trying to focus on the missing middle, which is between downtown and suburbia. That's where I think our biggest opportunity is at the biggest bang for the buck, as they say. The thing I'm really getting frustrated with is trying to get people at the city to stop saying no to everything I propose. Eventually I get it built, but the process you have to go through adds a significant amount of cost. I did manage to get one project through recently on a corner lot, which was intended for interior lot. They couldn't show me a clause in the bylaw that said it had to be built on an interior lot, so they had to give me the permit begrudgingly. After 3 months of arguing, they've now changed the bylaw so no one else can do it. How do we get the federal government, provincial government, and the local municipal governments to work together to encourage creativity, not discourage it?
Yeah, and I'm sorry you went through that process. I hope part of it would have been on my watch, so this is discouraging to hear. Part of the problem has been, and rightly so, the criticism is that municipalities around Ontario and other provinces all have very, very different standards, and if you practice in one, you go try to build the exact same thing in an adjacent municipality and not be allowed to do it. And there needs to be more standardization across Ontario, except across Canada within certain building typologies. That was the beauty of the CMHC model that you talked about, and I'm thrilled to meet you now because I've been wanting to write an article just on this very issue about. I'd love to replicate in the 2020s a multifamily version that the provinces say if your lot size is a minimum of this, then this is automatically approved anywhere in Ontario. Because it needs to get to that level again to make the affordability possible and the timelines reasonable. The accumulation of process steps, again, there's been no incentive so far for municipalities to hack them, and it's been very, very difficult, and I've tried to hack processes from the public sector side, and there's always a really good reason why it can't be hacked. I think it's going to take intervention from senior level governments, and it's usually the provinces in this situation. But I know CMHC is actually, I'm working on a project in Eastern Canada that's actually financed by the program you administer, that is actually trying to get, CMHC is financing a municipality to try to figure a way to hack the process and allow more variety of housing types. So 5 years ago, no one cared. I think people are starting to care in a very big way within the public sector in different levels, and I think you'll see progress. But the problem is we're so deep in the crisis right now is it can't happen fast enough.
I would also add, if I may, Steve, part of the big problem is that the approval processes and the costs involved for small projects are not as different as so smaller projects are very development process. In order to
Good evening. I'm a post-war baby boomer myself. And what I've noticed, the elders when I was young would be passing on by my age. Us baby boomers are a lot more healthy, lasting longer, do wish our homes. So what I'm interpreting from the media, the fact that there is less sales passing on by the elders to the young again. So we have to either develop further out, and the ideology of satellite cities is an intriguing addition, or the conglomeration and putting into high-rise on the bus lines and all that is not what I would find socially because of my upbringing in the post-war baby boom house, the box, that we're changing our whole cultural way of being this way. Now, do these generation under us wish that? Most of them have been brought up through us, the baby boomers, with the same. So what is it that we can do other than the ideology of the satellite cities and make little areas? Because what happened when I first came in. I bought a very inexpensive home, and it's gone up 8 times in value. So, but I redesigned, rebuilt my home. I have studied architecture as well. But the whole thing seems that we should be moving more. What are we going to do with us baby boomers existing longer? So what do you think we should be doing? You people with the CMHC, all this financial maneuvering and everything, the value of my home having grown so strong is making it too much for the other generation under. So what do you agree with the satellite city ideology, or what is your
Really
answer?
interesting point, because we have a perfect storm going on right now. We have an echo of the boom, so a very large population segment naturally coming through the system, which is just the family formation of the it's the repetition that happens every couple of years. Larger population in that age demographic. Smaller household sizes, so to accommodate the same population, you need more dwelling units than you used to in that. We have higher immigration levels, and we have people holding onto their houses longer, and for very good reasons. I'm busy moving my in-laws out of their house. They just hit 90. They now can't do it, but you know, my grandfather's generation would have left that house probably in their 60s or 70s. So, you know, as people hold on to it longer, because that's affordable, it's a really good quality of life for people. There's all these factors, but they're all happening all at the same time, which just creates that big gap. Yeah. So there's no one solution. There's no magic bullet that fixes this. One of the things, you know, new communities can help. That's one part of the solution. Introducing new housing typologies in existing communities where infrastructure is a lot cheaper to provide, and by the way, the approvals process is usually faster in an infill situation than a brand new community. More choices. So I do believe, I don't want to speak for the millennials because I'm absolutely not one myself, but I do believe that giving them more choices, more variety, a wider palette of things you can have is the right answer, because you know, you can aspire to that, but you're going to have to save for it. You can go for this, you can have an intermediate step or whatever, but the monocultures we have in a lot of cities, it's this or this, you know, that's not good. So we have to widen the choice. So there is no easy way out of this other than have more supply and more choice about what that supply looks like.
And it may look different from place to place. So that idea that it might look different in rural Saskatchewan where my parents live, or in the Arctic, or in downtown Toronto, they're going to look different. And so that's the difference, and that there may be different types. If you choose to live in Ottawa, your neighborhood may change because it is a big, fast-growing city.
Yes, and again, the flexibility of the plan. I think as an architect myself, I am really big on, I really support the idea of having flexible plans that you can then subdivide, that you can play with, that you can then, again, subdivide and even, you know, sell. And it's a smaller unit, and it still has a garden. It's lovely. I really, you know, I'm very wary of condominiums, and I'll tell you why. As a Romanian, I lived my whole childhood and young adulthood. Fortunately, not myself. I did not live in a condominium, but I lived in Bucharest, which is a city full of condominiums, not in the way we understand them here, really problematic situation. So people, so the actual fund there, like the housing market in Bucharest is made out of a lot of condominiums. People don't have other kind of, well, I mean, they started to have choices, and now they're going, yes, out of the city very much. But they really like home ownership also because during the Soviet bloc, a lot of them, and especially in the beginnings, you may know or not, in the 50s, early 50s, they were literally confiscated their houses and they were kicked out. It was very brutal. or some of them, my own husband, his grandmother and grandfather were kicked out, and then they were allowed to, from their house, and then they were allowed to live in their house, in their own house, and pay rent. So there's a lot of problems that happened during the communist years in, not only Romania, obviously, Poland, Hungary, all the Soviet bloc, and Russia, of course, that made people very, very tuned into, okay, I can afford a house, I'm gonna get a house, no matter how small. So this is the to just get to cover that thing of why Romania is literally at the top of the list of home ownership, which kind of puts us in a developed country position, but whatever, we're not really there. Anyway, it's interesting, right? So, but yeah, just finishing up on the flexibility. I think a flexible and a very diverse housing market is good.
Maybe it's back to that missing middle again, because I think that we're well beyond the single-family detached as the solution. The question, but that the condo is not also necessarily what we want. So the question is.
So Ben,
Well, great. I'm sorry if there was more questions. We should.
just being mindful of the time,
Yes,
I
we
think
should
we,
probably finish
but
up.
we probably have time for one or two quick questions with quick answers, like 60-second answers,
Okay.
probably. But let me pass it on to you, and then Evan, did you have another question? Yeah.
Evan's our timekeeper and the one that's going to take us over.
Millennial and a former economist taking the opportunity cost and transition into IT. I guess my question will be on the historical side. Thanks for holding tonight. Given the relatively stable trend of increasing prices of housing products over wage, within the academia and the industry in general, has there been a broad consensus of what those key drivers behind the price increase over the wage are? And are any of those actionable in terms of short-term policy levers?
Yeah, when we see now as interest rates rise, as house pricings have, but there's still a supply issue, right? So house prices haven't dropped dramatically as they've increased because there is a supply issue in that. They've dropped, but not to the degree you would think. Yeah. No. And for us, one of the big indicators of arrears and people not paying their mortgages is income, is their jobs, and it's what's the employment rate. That's one of our best lead indicators for sure.
Hey there. I'm a millennial, and I just had a quick thing that I believe is being overlooked, or I'm not sure if it's being overlooked. I'd like to sort of hear your feedback on it. But as a millennial who bought recently, I bought in June of last year, are people considering the effects on municipalities? When I was looking for a home, I wasn't necessarily set, my partner and I, on single family, condo, what have you, based on the sort of new world in the pandemic with work from home and things like that. I was looking, being based out of Ottawa, I was looking basically from Petawawa in the west all the way to like Rockland in the east, all the way down to Cornwall in the south when I was looking to purchase my home. And it wasn't so much, again, defined by what type of housing I wanted. It was very driven by what type of housing I could afford and how the infrastructure and community would support my home ownership, aside from just like the financial aspects of it or the typology of it. And is that being considered? Is it something that's come up recently specifically because of COVID, or how are people dealing with the fact that I wanted to get into home ownership as a millennial and my requirements for location related to employment were sort of open in that manner.
So the phrase drive till you qualify has been around for a little while. And I actually, when I bought my first house, was another big price spike happened, and I ended up having to go much further away than I intended. No, it was not as extreme as the one that's going on right now, but this was late 90s. There was one of these big jumps over a very short period of time, and we ended up having to go, I was in the Toronto area, and I had to go out the GO train line till I could afford a house, right? That was the decision. Now, I was tied to a job that was in the center of the city, so unlike in 2023, where a lot of people aren't necessarily tied to those locations with jobs anymore, there's almost like a scattering effect that's happening with people going till they can afford because they're not so tied by employment. So the municipalities actually risk, losing a lot of people to outlying areas. And the interesting thing is, if you look at migration patterns, Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver are losing large populations to other parts of Canada. Ottawa is a beneficiary of that. We pick up a lot of people coming from Montreal and Toronto. Actually, a lot of people who move to Ottawa. And I often do this little game, like in a room like this, how many of you actually had the chance to, either worked in another city like Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, and moved here at some point and had the chance to move out, but didn't because of housing prices? And about half the room, it usually says that they did have the opportunity for those jobs and didn't do it. So there's obviously, it's always been going on, but it's more extreme now. And now Ottawa is seeing an out-migration to the areas outside of Ottawa for the first time in very large numbers. A lot of people don't want to acknowledge that that's actually going on, but the largest out-migration of Ottawa, people from Ottawa is not to Toronto or Montreal, because we have a net increase. It's actually out to the small communities outside of Ottawa. It's actually a very noticeable number now. So the point you're doing, and then people are making choices on, do I have if I'm going to live in Almont, do I have the amenities I want to live in Almont or Petawawa? Do I have, and when you're younger, your thought of amenities is different than when you're older. So you don't think about hospitals and some of those, like access to doctors, the way you do. You think more about recreation and grocery stores and things like that. And there is an effect going on now, and it is a changed pattern. And that's why a lot of the major development companies in Ottawa have projects outside the Ottawa boundaries now, and we're in areas that they didn't traditionally invest in the past because people want to be out there.
Okay. Thank you for those questions. I think it really sets up the stage for some of the three sessions we are going to have. I'm really excited to hear about these questions that were posed today. So I'm going to hand it over to Evan for a wrap-up question and some comments from him.
Yeah, again, we just wanted to thank the three of you and, of course, Ben for this evening. We know you have some busy schedules, and we really appreciate you giving us an evening of your time. It was a really informative discussion. I kind of like to wrap every discussion up with a very positive question. We've been talking about some serious issues tonight. So just 15, 30 seconds each, a development that's come across your desk at the city, at CMHC, through your research, that has you feeling optimistic about the future. I'm not going to plug that. You did, but yes.
I like Greystone. Greystone would have been on my short list of 5. The one that I find really interesting is not in Ottawa, it's in Hamilton. An architect in Hamilton is designing a building where the building is designed so that the units are built to the minimum of code from the minute you move in. Like, it's the most basic fixtures within it, most basic units. You have concrete floors. You don't have all those elements, but the idea is that people could get in, own it, start building up ownership, and then as they have more money, they can improve their own units. Now, I'm sure they're going to drive their neighbors nuts doing construction inside the building, but it is a really interesting concept about what's the most basic unit you can build with the most basic elements to allow someone to actually have ownership, and I think that's kind of cool.
I think I mentioned it already, but sticking to ownership, because I have lots that are in my heart about rental and really amazing products that folks, partnerships we've done. But on a home ownership one is a project to pilot we're doing on different ways you can tenure on reserve in Quebec with a major lender and us, and the way you can do 5 to 10% down payment there where you couldn't before. I think that's an exciting one for home ownership for sure.
I'm not sure what to add. Yeah, I've already, given you my views on that, so I differ from that.
Well, yes, so on that note, let's have an